Good afternoon, and thank you for returning and joining us for this conversation. I want to open with some words from Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe. He writes that perhaps it has always been this way. Perhaps democracies have always been communities of fellow beings, and therefore societies of separation. They may well have always had a set of people who are regarded as undesirables, of whom one wants to be rid, and who, in this way, must be left completely or partially without rights. Mbembe conceptualizes these people, or non-fellow beings as they refer to, as terrifying objects of which he says, yesterday, Black and Jew were forced upon them as labels. They were the favored names for such objects. Today, Blacks and Jews are known by other names: Islam, the Muslim, the Arab, the foreigner, the immigrant, the refugee, and the intruder, to mention only a few. Black and Muslim peoples are the terrifying objects at the center of our conversation this afternoon, and an anchor for understanding all that disinformation narratives are inextricably tied to a construction of the other, and that ignoring the other dooms our attempts to address the problem that unites us today. So does being ignorant of histories of the other, as evidenced by analyses that situate Islamophobia as a post-9/11 phenomenon, rather than acknowledging the Crusades of the 11th century, or using a single phrase from the Declaration of Independence, as it's echoed in the Black Panther Party's 10-point program, to mischaracterize the program as a violent manifesto. Scholars Rachel Kuo and Alice Marwick, drawing on the work of researchers including Dean Freelon, Daniel Kreese, and Cambridge PhD student Matali Nkonge, who is out there somewhere, offer this 4-point provocation, which I'd like to use to open our conversation. We must ground disinformation studies in history, science, culture, and politics, and society. We must center analyses of how social differentiation, such as race, gender, and class, shape dynamics of disinformation. We must foreground questions of how institutional power and economic, social, cultural, and technological structures shape disinformation. And we must state and maintain explicit commitments to justice and equality. It is with these points in mind that I'm pleased to engage in a critically oriented conversation with Esosa Osa, founder and CEO of Onyx Impact. As founder and CEO, Esosa sets the organization's direction, leading efforts to fight digital harm, amplify Black voices, and create healthier online ecosystems. We are joined by Mobashra, Tazamal, the Associate Director of the Bridge Initiative, specializing in the impact on the war of terror discourse and the state-sponsored Islamophobia worldwide. She's the author of a chapter on the edited volume, Global Islamophobia and the Rise of Populism, published by Oxford University Press in 2024. I'll now turn things over to Esosa and Mobashra to offer their own opening statements before we address a few moderated questions and conclude with questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Meredith, for the wonderful and I think deeply needed introduction and grounding. I lead Onyx Impact because I have seen propaganda aimed at Black communities turn into real world danger. Disinformation is as old as white supremacy and has been used for generations to deny, deter, and discourage our communities from all types of civic engagement to control our communities. In the 2020 elections in the US, racialized lies targeted Black voters and Black election workers pretty intensely and caused real harm. And when the harm was at its peak, in my previous role, I was tasked with both helping to find and to protect and to monitor the death threats against Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss. as the threats kept escalating and the state was nowhere to be found. Worked with election officials dealing with doxing and intimidation. And what that made clear is that information warfare against Black communities is both a political strategy and a public safety crisis. And in 2026, the biggest challenge is from the scale of what we're seeing combined with the intent. The narratives move faster, the distribution is cheaper, the payoff is unfortunately the same. It is the destruction of Black civic power and making Black violence feel normal. And unfortunately, we are seeing disinformation show up as policy cover in so many ways, and not just as a social permission to harass. Right now in the United States, there is a disinformation campaign around equity, around the term DEI, right? That's being used to roll back generations of progress, used to eliminate billions of dollars in investment in Black communities, and right now being used at the level of the Supreme Court to very likely dismantle the last vestiges of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act, one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in our country's history, that ended Jim Crow, is about to be ended because of a DEI disinformation campaign. And so we all know that authoritarianism is targeting marginalized communities first, and at Onyx Impact, we try to meet that with the infrastructure that you named, providing the first comprehensive analysis of Black disinformation online ecosystems, launching the Digital Green Book and our Blackout Report, building an information integrity lab, launching Invest in Black Media. How do we show that we are, as they say, 10 toes down in this fight, in these trenches, and are willing to protect the communities on the front line? Because everybody in this room knows the problem. The communities that are facing the highest volume of targeted disinformation have the thinnest resources to defend themselves. And those resources are shrinking now. The equity-based rollback of funding and of resources to Black institutions, to Black media, to frontline communities is devastating. The Black News just announced that they had an 80% decline in revenue last year. It's going to take all of us to turn this around, to change this, to understand how this is impacting folks on the ground in real time. But other than that, I think everything is fine.
Mobashra.
Thank you. I'm going to co-sign everything Esosa says. And Meredith, thank you for that framing. Thank you for that quote. That was a brilliant way to introduce our conversation. A little bit about the Bridge Initiative. We're a research project on Islamophobia housed at Georgetown University. We were originally founded in 2015, and as you remember, if you can recall, that was when President Trump announced his first presidential election. And our founder, Dr. John Esposito, had noticed how quickly anti-Muslim misinformation, disinformation, stereotypes, tropes were spreading online, especially from the, quote, Islamophobia industry, which is a network of individuals, organizations, politicians, think tanks, donor funds, that spread just Islamophobic rhetoric. And he noticed that it was spreading online and there was no real research or information on what this is. So Bridge was established to provide factual, accessible, public-facing information on Islamophobia. In 2015, like I said, that was the first year President Trump announced his candidacy for president. And his 2016 campaign made Islamophobia the platform. I would argue that is when we saw the mainstreaming of Islamophobia in the United States. We had the introduction of the Muslim ban, a very blatant anti-Muslim policy. Disinformation is used to sow division in society, And I want to emphasize that when it comes to Islamophobia, it's used by established voices. It's used by politicians. It's used by our mainstream media networks, not Fringe, not some anonymous profile on X, but your mainstream news organizations, your journalists. It comes from academia as well. We're in an academic university. I want to know academics play a role in normalization. And I want to just focus specifically on the impacts of disinformation and look at the Southport riots, which happened in 2024. It was one of the worst race riots the UK had experienced in decades. If you recall, for those of us here in the UK, it happened after a horrible, horrible knife attack led to the deaths of 3 young girls. As soon as the attack happened online on X, disinformation spread so quickly with commentators, individuals with hundreds of thousands of followers, if not millions, claiming that the assailant was Muslim, refugee, foreigner, immigrant. All of those are used interchangeably and often is used to just say Muslim. And despite authorities, which revealed the assailant's identity, which isn't normal because he was underage, he was 17, and he was an individual born in Cardiff, UK citizen, despite them revealing his identity, far-right mobs engaged in mass violent actions across the country. To take it back to disinformation online, what happened the day after the attack, there was a study done by Dr. Mark Owen Jones. He's an expert on digital authoritarianism, does fantastic work on looking at disinformation, and found at least 27 million impressions for posts stating or speculating that the attacker was Muslim, migrant, refugee. Some of the most influential voices were Andrew Tate, Tommy Robinson, and Darren Grimes. And according to Jones, this was a clear attempt to exploit a tragic incident, pushing an anti-immigrant and xenophobic agenda, despite there being no evidence. But I think that's one of the things we need to know. Islamophobia doesn't require evidence. Promoting anti-Muslim stereotypes and tropes, you don't need evidence. For Muslims, you are guilty until proven innocent in the realm of Islamophobia. So going back to the violence that happened on British streets, there was a mosque in Southport that was firebombed. Bricks were thrown while congregants were inside. Mobs of white men harassed and violently assaulted people of color on the streets. A hotel housing asylum seekers in Rotherham was set alight. There were multiple mosques that were attacked. Muslim-owned businesses were destroyed. And even gravestones, Muslim gravestones, were not left untouched. There was an incident in Burnley where they were vandalized. And research by EQUI found 43% rise in anti-Muslim incidents between 2023 and 2024, and they marked Southport riots as one of the heightened levels. The ease with which these racist claims spread demonstrates something else. It demonstrates the normalization in British society today, and it's not just social media, it's our politicians. All you need to do is look at the rhetoric coming from members of our elected class, and you can hear how Muslims are to blame for all of society's ills. British Muslims, whether they engage in prayer or they take part in the electoral system, they are somehow manufactured as a threat. And this leads to real consequences. Data shows that about 45% of all religiously aggravated hate crimes target Muslims. Muslims represent about 5 to 6% of the British population. So I'm going to close it off here to just say that we're living in a time period where Islamophobic discourse is just so common. It's like having your morning cup of coffee. It's so seeped into our daily lives that we don't even recognize when it's happening. It's from the headlines in our newspapers to the conversations we see on social media. Bigotry against Muslims has been completely normalized, and this has created great fear amongst British Muslims. There's conversations about British Muslims who have been here for generations talking about maybe we need to leave, we don't feel safe. Children in school facing bullying, it's at an all-time high. So I think any effort to tackle disinformation must begin with a reckoning of how mainstream and powerful voices have played a role in it. If we focus on individuals on the streets or individual profiles on X, that's not going to mitigate the issue. It comes from the top. So yeah.
Thank you both. I have just 3 questions for my interlocutors here today. The first one, Mobashra, you've sort of hinted at this in your opening statements. But around the world, disinformation that leads to physical violence and other forms of harm, we know it's an age-old phenomenon, particularly for structurally marginalized communities. That disinformation is also connected to what Arlie Russell Hochschild calls deep stories, those emotional ties to certain narratives that people feel. Mm-hmm. I want to start with you, Esosa. What are some of the deep stories that underpin contemporary disinformation narratives that target the communities at the center of your work? And then, Mobashra, I'll ask you to take up the same question.
Great question. When I think through some of these deep stories, deep false stories, disinformation narratives, I think the first deep story that comes to mind is that Black power must be illegitimate. Mm-hmm. I think this comes across in a host of different ways. When Black folks are successfully shaping political outcomes, the story becomes fraud. When Black leaders govern, the story becomes corruption. When Black communities demand basic dignity, the story becomes danger. How do you make our participation feel suspicious? When you can do that, you can also make who democracy is supposed to help feel optional. Mm-hmm. I think the second deep story is that equity is discrimination. Mm-hmm. Right? A lot of this is because of race and harm neutral messaging that has been pushed for so long that people have forgotten who was harmed and what remedy constitutes, right? But Onyx Impact released a blackout report on our website or at blackoutreport.org, and we documented in just the first 8 months of the administration more than 15,000 specific harms to Black communities, attacks on health, wealth, and progress. And what that looked like is that as long as they can make you think that this is about corporate classes that suck, they can eliminate $70 million in flood protections for Black communities. As long as they can make you think that this is about fairness in who gets into college, they can eliminate $30 million in maternal mortality health funding, $10 million in sickle cell funding, a rare disease that impacts almost exclusively Black folks. Mm-hmm. They called the national research on sickle cell disease woke ideology. Now, my little brother suffers from sickle cell disease. One of the bravest human beings I know. And $10 million is a lot for a rare blood disorder. To see how these narratives, from woke to CRT to DEI, as long as they can make you only think of a culture war that they created, the real harm that is happening on the ground is incomprehensible. It is only the best correlation is to the nadir in U.S. history, which they don't teach you about, but that is what ended Reconstruction. That is what brought through Jim Crow. That is the level of destruction that's happening right now.
Mobashra.
Other than that, again,
everything's fine.
Everything's fine. I'm gonna take it back to what you said in the quote, Meredith, about the Crusades, because I think a lot of the deep stories that we have arise from that time period. So I'm going to talk about certain stereotypes and tropes. It was during the Crusade period that the Catholic Church called for military campaigns to take the Holy Land from the Islamic Empire. During this period, Christian theologians and other important figures presented Islam as a false religion, called the Prophet Muhammad a fake prophet, described Muslims as heretics, but also imparted these tropes that are so common today of Muslims being violent, misogynistic, sexually deviant, backwards, uncivilized. But one of the biggest things and from which all of these tropes and stereotypes come from is the civilizational threat, the existential threat, the us versus them. The narrative frames Islam and Muslims as in complete opposition to the, quote, West, but it also frames them as not just a security threat, so in terms of violence and that stuff, but also as a cultural threat. And you hear this today in today's conversations. So, Nigel Farage constantly brings up British values and Western values, and it's always in opposition to, well, those Muslims in Britain, they don't agree with our values, whatever they are. They're very vague and undefined. But that builds on these notions and these deep stories that have been built for centuries, not taking into account that Islam and Muslims have been present in Europe for centuries themselves. It is not a dichotomy, but it's often presented because of this us versus them narrative. And the clash of civilizations argument was actually by an academic. It was by Samuel Huntington. He argued that after the fall of the Soviet, the biggest conflict would be between the West and Islam. And so the binary basically says the West and Islam are inherently opposed, but the West is the good guy and Islam and Muslims are the bad guys. This has become the underlying story from which most of the other narratives of, you will hear right now in Texas, the hysteria, manufactured hysteria around, quote, Sharia law. You have the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, again, arises from this sort of deep story. And then you have the grooming gangs narrative, which we constantly hear from right-wing politicians who weaponize real issues of child sexual exploitation in this country to frame it as a racialized issue. And all of these are built upon that deep, deep story that say that Islam and the West are diametrically opposed.
Mm-hmm. I take up both of those points and think about this concept that I call destructive abstraction, where people will take these themes and these deep stories and use them as tools to, as you said, remove things like funding under the guise of it being woke, or crack down on certain practices under the guise of them being a challenge to a culture and a society. That leads me to think of how leaders in high places are pulling on destructive abstraction to engage in some of these disinformation campaigns.
That's right.
And what we've seen both in the UK and in the US is that progenitors of racialized disinformation are finding legitimization through their connections to high-ranking political officials. As an example, in March, a conservative MP made statements that incorrectly aligned a Green Party deputy minister with the Iranian government, and those statements were covered by parliamentary protection. That was similar to the way that the First Amendment protected then-candidate Donald Trump when he made the statement that Haitian immigrants were eating pets during the lead-up to the 2024 election. I'd like to ask you both, how can the public address disinformation in high places when it's circulated via mechanisms that are designed to protect provocative speech? Mobashra, let's begin with you.
Yeah, I think, well, like I said in my opening statement, Islamophobia is coming from our elected representatives, from the people in the highest positions of power. And I think what we need to remember is that there's a difference between free speech and hate speech. Sure, you can say what you want, but there are consequences to certain levels of speech, especially speech that puts the lives of other individuals at risk. So for Mohsin Ali, the one that you mentioned, it's important to note that it's not just right-wing, because even Prime Minister Keir Starmer gave some sort of legitimacy to the narrative that was being pushed about Ali being some sort of Iranian government sympathizer. So today, I want to note that Islamophobic disinformation is not coming from a persecuted minority. It's coming from the halls of power. When it comes to the public to address that, it's constantly calling it out, but also not just I guess, debunking it, because I don't think that really necessarily does anything. You have to look at what the underlying thing is.
I heard debunking solves everything.
Okay, how many times when you see something online, AP does it, Reuters does it, and I think they do a great job. I think sometimes it is valuable, but that doesn't stop the conversation.
Right.
You still have, when Trump made those remarks about Haitian immigrants, that is deep-seated bigotry, and that's what you need to call out. Not that, oh, let me go find a story and say, look, it's not true, that's not true. No one cares about that. It's the underlying message that he's trying to put out there, and that's what needs to be tackled. So it's kind of like looking at the manipulation and looking at the underlying narratives rather than the actual claim being made.
Right.
Because if you just focus on debunking, sometimes you grant it some sort of legitimacy.
Understood. So the way that fact-checking is now being used as a tool against disinformation, but necessarily giving people more facts doesn't change
Yes.
the attitudes that
Yes.
underlie the
Absolutely.
narratives. Understood. Esosa.
And to, continue on that point, individual disinformation narratives were almost at this moment, a privilege of like 4 or 5 years ago, right? When we are now in an environment of propaganda, of what you all know, nonstop, information, true information, false information, who knows? It's overwhelming, and it requires massive repetition and amplification to have any hope of breaking through with any message, including a basic message of truth, right? And so understanding what new distributed networks of reach are to communities that matter, to communities impacted, to be able to move them information at the same speed, right? That is what is most important. I think when we're looking at this from officials in power, we've got to find ways to raise the cost of the lie
Yeah.
in a way that we still haven't figured out yet. I'm thinking in Minnesota when they arrested all the journalists, right? They arrested the protest leaders who are still, Georgia Ford and Don Lemon, they're still fighting, lost, right? Many of the legal arguments were false at the beginning. They were not real. They were kangaroo court type situations, right? But it took until last month for them to be dismissed, right? And that's not really accountability. And then lastly, at the institutional level, I think we have to figure out what courage means for us in this moment. We are seeing institutions, academic institutions, media institutions, political institutions, kowtow, bend the knee, at frightening speed. At frightening speed. The longing, the need for folks to hold on to their chairs at the table of power while that table is being picked up and moved out of the room is insane. And so there needs to be a deep level of courage to figure out how many of us are frogs in boiling water.
I want to talk a little bit about collective identity. So far, our conversation has talked about the us and them narratives, and specifically how they are central to disinformation campaigns by painting a picture and constructing an other. Now, white Christian nationalism is a theme that connects the work that both of you do with your respective organizations to address disinformation that harms Black and Muslim communities. Esosa, for example, you appeared in the 2023 documentary Against All Enemies, which chronicles the development of far-right militias in the US that recruit military veterans. And in 2025, the Onyx Impact Report published the Digital Green Book to help Black communities actively fight disinformation. Mobashra, in 2025, you published a chapter in the book on Christian nationalism and detailed the strategies used to historically and contemporarily other brown refugees in the US and Europe. You, through the Bridge Initiative, have also appeared in a number of summits and panels like this one and highlighted the threat of emergent ethno-nationalism in countries including the US, the UK, and France. I want to ask you both, how does a sense of collective identity get effectively weaponized in disinformation campaigns? What is it that makes it so powerful that it works across global contexts? And conversely, how do vulnerable communities constructively use their sense of collective identity to resist such efforts?
I'm happy to.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. For disinformation that is based off kind of group identity, it plays to our very basic human emotions. We are social creatures. We think in groups. So from a psychological aspect, it plays on our deepest levels of connections. And if we identify with groups, whether it be based on gender, class, religion, race, whatever it may be, if your group feels attacked or if there's a manufactured threat, you're going to more likely feel that there is something happening. And once there's a threat that's established, what do? So in the case of the US, where Islamophobia has been the rallying cry for so many politicians. Take, for example, in Texas, where they recently had elections in March, a lot of the GOP that were running utilized manufactured hysteria around the Muslim community in Texas to claim that they were going to take over the state. And what should voters do? Vote for me. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to ban Sharia. No one's trying to impose Sharia. Doesn't exist. They framed Muslim community development as some sort of Sharia compound. Private Islamic schools are framed as, again, they're going to Islamify Texas. And so for non-Muslim Texans, they feel that their group is going to be under attack. But also in the US context and in European context, there's a racialized element to it. Let's not forget that. Racism, white supremacy is deeply embedded, and we haven't ever addressed those head on. So when I talked about in the beginning, Christian national sentiments began around the time of the Crusades, and within the US, I think the US's establishment was founded on white Christian nationalism. We have the concept of manifest destiny. That is the claim that God gave white men the right to take over the entire continent and commit genocide against the indigenous population. And I think this arose again. There was a surge in white Christian nationalism with the election of Barack Obama. And I argue in a certain...
How is that related?
Many of my pieces, I argue that the election of Donald Trump was a white nationalist backlash to the election of Barack Obama. During Barack Obama's presidency, the level of racism that we experienced in the country was just, for lack of a better word, insane. I still remember the New Yorker political cartoon of President Obama and former First Lady Michelle Obama dressed as Muslim militants, and it played on both anti-Black stereotypes and anti-Muslim stereotypes. And this is the New Yorker. It wasn't some, like Fox News. It's the New Yorker. We also had the birther conspiracy theory. Again, the idea that a Black man couldn't be president because he wasn't American. And they used these disinformation claims that he wasn't born in the US or whatnot to argue that he couldn't be president. And then you have the Tea Party, and then you have Trump. So we've had very pinpointed moments where white Christian nationalism has been leading the country. It's been the ideology that people subscribe to. And disinformation just amplifies it. For other communities in the US, I think the US does a fantastic job of solidarity amongst marginalized communities. We have a rich history of resistance against white supremacy, and it's a long history that's been there, and tapping into those solidarity networks is a way to counteract it, but again, it's coming from the halls of power, so that is the challenge that we face. Along with that, those who are trying to counter it, you face roadblocks of, we were talking about it, funding for groups and organizations that do this type of work. There's so many roadblocks in place, so it's just such a massive challenge.
You know, we're talking about turning belonging into a weapon almost in so many ways, but oftentimes I find myself as a panelist being asked to answer questions that the moderator is an actual expert on. And so for this one, girl, I'm gonna kick it back to you.
Collective identity and weaponized and disinformation campaigns. That was great. Nicely done. So one of the things that sticks out to me, and we talked about it a little bit yesterday, I can't remember which presenter mentioned how Elon Musk was funded in order to purchase Twitter, but it aligns with some of the work that I've done in studying Black Twitter. It's no mistake that Elon Musk decided to purchase a platform that was not profitable, right, but did have the ability to influence and to shift the news media's agenda when it was talking about particular stories. And that was simply because of the so-called overrepresentation of Black people on the platform and how Black people were using the platform, doing everything from watching television together and laughing and joking and keeping up with award shows together, which allowed them to bond as a community and sort of set the foundation for something like the movement for Black Lives to really take off, where you had these people who, because they had been in conversation with each other for such a long time, were able to amplify messages in ways that other apparatus simply could not. And of course, there was a number of things that you can attribute to the affordances of the platform. But what you see here is that Musk and others like him recognized how powerful it is to be able to use a tool of technology like this one, especially among people who are otherwise disempowered, to speak out, to organize, and to mobilize people. So what do you do with something like that? You can't break up the existence and the background and the history, but you can control the means of information production. So you buy the platform. And what I see here is really these vulnerable communities using the technologies that are available to us in order to combat disinformation. I'm mindful that in the United States, the first newspaper published by Free Black Men used as its opening missive a word and a phrase, rather, to say, we wish to plead our own cause, that too long have others spoken for us, and attributed to Black people every minor trifle that they think separates us from being a part of civilized society. So the mission of Freedom's Journal, as the first Black newspaper in America, was to combat disinformation. Vulnerable communities use the technologies that they have to do this work. We don't necessarily have the same sort of representation in government. We don't have the same sort of representation in terms of capital and being able to buy platforms or publish, but we do have the ability to, at the very least, use communication and communication technologies to get our messages out. That said, Esosa is turning questions back to me. It's my turn to turn questions and open up for questions from our audience. We have a few moments left and look forward to questions from you. There's one in the front, there are two in the back, there are a couple more down front.
Hi there. My name's Matali. Thank you for the shout out. I have a question around platform ownership and media consolidation. So one of the things that I think has been really clear in the discussion, and thank you for the discussion, is this idea that there has to be a counter to these narratives, but the stories are deep. And I'm wondering what you are thinking about what happens when, because of media consolidation, those that are creating these harmful, deep stories against vulnerable communities also own the Washington Post, or also own television stations, or also own, and I'm looking at some of these acquisitions, particularly in the United States, where the same groups that really promote these messages are consolidating their media holdings to such a way that there cannot be that counter-hegemonic voice. And I would love to know how can we build power where there's this wall being built?
Phenomenal question, as of course, but I think that we need, goes back to the Freedom's Journal, goes back to the Black press, goes back to the need to invest in institutions and Black media, independent journalists, that this is not the first time that the United States has gone through authoritarianism, right? With Jim Crow is, by definition, in almost every way, shape, and form, an authoritarian government, right? And Black press stood up when nobody else would, to tell our stories truthfully, because and we need to make sure that those institutions are being supported. When we tried to put out the Blackout Report, we didn't just say 15,723 harms, right? We sourced every single one of them. We went to the Washington Post, to a journalist there who was very, very interested in writing a story. Basically got it 2 weeks later, had everything complete. 2 days before it was supposed to drop, his editor's editor killed the story. Said it was, quote unquote, too charged. I was like, either the cuts happened or they didn't. We went to NBC News next to publish the Blackout Report. A journalist there said, "Thank you so much. This is the story I've been wanting to write all year." Wrote the story a day before it was supposed to drop. NBC News announces that it is firing every diversity vertical that it has. NBC Black, NBC Latino, NBC AAPI, NBC LGBTQ, we're gone. There was no one left to write the story. This is what is happening in real time. So Axios ended up publishing it because there was a senior writer there who would not stop, who was Black. And so without this level of understanding of what that broader that media consolidation will mean, we are right now trying to push, like, oh, we've got to win online, we've got to win social media, we've got to be involved in all these voices, I'll get all these creators. They've already done that, and they're going all the way back to buying up legacy media. So we got to get better and smarter, and we got to invest into the people that have been fighting this, that know how to.
I have one more to add. Independent media establishment that came out following, I think it was probably around the time MSNBC was firing a bunch of people. Mehdi Hasan was fired from MSNBC for, he was outspoken on Israel's genocide in Gaza, and he went and established Zateo, and it is fantastic. They do amazing, amazing reporting. They're bringing up new journalists. We do have spaces from progressive and independent media. It's, again, you're facing established media that have been there for God knows how long and have so much financial backing. It's about us supporting these independent and new voices and building them up and building that counter narrative to established voices.
Hi, thank you. I'm Sohan D'Souza, a counter disinformation researcher and investigator. I happen to have investigated the Southport spin-off riots. I've worked with Mark, actually. And one thing that struck me was, yes, there were many white nationalists in the supply chain of disinformation, but the second main vector of spread was this Europe Invasion account, which is actually run by, we discern a Turkish couple in Dubai. The third one in this chain was an Indian, some guy traced to a guy in India. And the fifth one was this guy in Pakistan, apparently, who was apparently using some kind of AI assist tool or something like that, which also brings in the AI angle. But it seems interesting that like a lot of, and this whole ecosystem is full of people like that, like people in India, Vietnam, Nigeria, who are boosting at least this information, if not fabricating it. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about like the kind of recruitment via monetization incentives of people in, what would ordinarily be marginalized communities, but they're just participating in this economy because they've been kind of bought out by these monetization incentives created by Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and so on.
Yeah, Sohan, that's fantastic and nice to meet you because I've followed your work with Mark on the Qatar plot. That was fantastic. Highly recommend all of you to read that report too because it's fantastic in talking about disinformation.
Thanks.
Yeah. Do you want me to, or should we take another question? I'm happy to.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So one of the things that when we look at disinformation when it comes to Islamophobia, it's not necessarily the usual Islamophobic actors. It's been monetized, and that again goes back to what we talk about the Islamophobia industry, where individuals have made lucrative careers out of spreading Islamophobic claims. And I think with this digital age, it's very interesting that individuals from marginalized communities are engaging in this very project. But again, it goes back to financial stability and what's going to make money. And unfortunately, these online platforms make it so the most extreme, the most violent, the most hateful content gets the most reactions, gets the most engagement, gets the most views. So we're working in a social media economy, and it's not necessarily also financial in the sense that sometimes it's becoming a profile, becoming an influencer. So having the most followers, having the most likes, having the most retweets, that's currency that we're also working with now. So there's just so many different things at play, and again, the financial aspect is a big part.
I think it's impossible to extricate disinformation from racial capitalism, and this is a test case or proof of that it doesn't matter where you are in the world or what group that you are aligned with, if it is profitable for you to put out misinformation in order to gain traffic, to bring people to whatever site or engage with what you're posting online, you will do so. It's a way for you to make money and reclaim some of the capital that's been extracted from the states in the nations where you live. It's one of the reasons that our other scholars mention that we have to foreground these questions of how institutional power and economic influence also shape disinformation. Another question.
Hi, thank you so much to the panelists for these sort of raw, difficult conversations. My question is for Mobashra. So I work in women's health, and sometimes it's a matter of life and death. You're talking about vaccination, people and their fertility. These are quite emotive topics, and there's a reason why people latch onto these topics in the first place. So this is probably the exception, but looking at a scenario like the grooming gangs, how do you hold a safe space to have the conversation without adding fuel to fire or leaning into whataboutism? But if there's honestly, truly a problem somewhere, and I know it gets miscategorized and mislabeled as this whole community, this and that, but there is still room to have that conversation. So in that case, even I am not immune to disinformation. What I heard was the police were worried about labeling this because they were worried about being accused of racism. So how do you balance that tension between, okay, facing into it versus letting it run off with the disinformation campaign? Thank you.
Brilliant question. That is something when I was looking at the grooming gangs narrative, I came across where police did say that in certain towns up north, they were afraid of labeling it or investigating it because of this fear of being labeled as racist or Islamophobic. First things first, child sexual exploitation is absolutely a major issue in this country. But the way the conversation is being had is framing it to explain that the perpetrators are doing what they're doing based on their racial or religious identities. And that's not how you solve an issue. That is textbook biological racism. There is a really good academic, Dr. Ella Cockbain, who's written about this. She works on child sexual exploitation, and she's actually written multiple papers talking about how this narrative actually deeply harms victims of child sexual exploitation because it's weaponized to further a racist narrative, but it doesn't actually tackle the issue. I think you'll see, I've seen it online on X where the likes of Tommy Robinson and co. will constantly post stories about white girls who have been sexually exploited by brown Muslim men. But there are also cases of white men exploiting white girls or brown girls. It's a topic of exploitation. But those cases where the perpetrators are white are never addressed, never talked about. And I think the conversation needs to be had. There is an issue. We need to address it. There's been institutional failures. The government has not tackled it. Authorities have not tackled it. They've failed it for these young girls. And there is a space to have this much needed conversations. And there are experts, like I mentioned, Dr. Cockbain, she's done fantastic work on how to approach it. But we shouldn't allow certain voices online to weaponize it for their own racist agenda.
And if we're at a point where it's like, I don't want to talk about this very important issue because I'm afraid I'm going to be accused of being racist, then, I mean, there's a level of laziness that is involved in that, that I think we can all, if we combine all of our efforts in this, or like, be able to overcome just slightly. And there's also a need, right, for understanding how folks, like how many people, raise your hand if you've ever gotten got by disinformation. And the rest of y'all are lying. Like, it works on everybody, right? It is how our society, or how we understand truth, how we understand repetition and amplification. If the President of the United States came out, whoever it was, every single day, and said the sky was green, every single day, and we saw it on social media 25 times a day, and the takes, and the takes to the takes, and the takes to the takes to the takes, and the newspapers are covering, can you believe this happened? We're gonna start having conversations about rainbows and the Aurora Borealis and other, right? It's going to eventually take hold. And so understanding that this is an issue that can impact everybody, that everyone can go down these rabbit holes, is something, it requires a certain level of empathy to be able to actually address and move people and help move people away from either in the short or long term.
Stéphane Gagnon from Canada. I do research on disinformation dynamics on social networks from an information systems perspective. So looking at big data sets, modeling, and I'd like to acknowledge that indeed racial misinformation and manipulation has not been on top of what you call the research data sets. And it's something to be repaired, I assume, because there is a lack of representation even there in our research assets. And my single question, although I would have many, Esosa, you have a report 2024 with a beautiful diagram, 5 boxes with all sorts of dynamics among the sources of disinformation, manipulation. Is there any follow-up in your research on that? And is there a chance of a doctoral thesis somewhere we can read? Or it's not a joke. Thank you.
To the dismay of my Nigerian parents, I am done with my degrees at this point. But so at Onyx Impact, we have an ethnographic research team that is in Black online spaces every single day, understanding the narratives, how they work, how they move. And there is something to be said for, like, we could put out an updated disinformation landscape anytime we want. And we have chosen not to because because what is needed right now is action. And in our, especially when we get into the political and the public policy world, right, the more, like, people, if we get to a point where people just really like to almost navel gaze about what is happening in communities and not what needs to happen. And so we are extremely focused on the responses that are fundamentally necessary. But you are, and this is a capacity issue. It is a resource issue. It is a structural issue that research, regardless of what you're talking about, right? Almost all research has a fundamental lack of curiosity on marginalized communities, right? You go to any large language model and you put in a prompt, and instead of saying, I'm an engineer, or I'm a professor, I'm a what have you, you say, I'm a black engineer, I'm a black professor. And see how wild that LLM gets, how quickly, right? Like, this is a broader and fundamental problem, but I appreciate that you read the report and found it. We've gotten so much positive feedback from that, and maybe we'll do it tomorrow.
I would point to some folks who are doing work in that space. AI for All the People, Data for Black Lives, Kim Gallen's project at Brown University. This research tends to be ghettoized, right? There's a reason that there are not more people here who could talk about the data sets that they're working with. But those data sets do exist, and I encourage people who are working in these spaces, when you look around and consider who is missing from your analysis, that you look for those scholars and those technologists and entrepreneurs who are making an effort to be very explicit about intersectional analysis and the data that we're using to train LLMs to do the analyses of different disinformation campaigns. They do exist.
That's right.
We have time for one more question. The timer is flashing at us up here.
Thank you for your talk today. I want to read a quick quote, if I could. All stories have protagonists and antagonists, heroes and villains. The problem with using this structure to talk about how we got here is that it flattens the narrative to be about good people and bad people, rather than providing illuminating stories about how movements succeed and they fail, stories of strategies and systems. So my question is that this particular area of this field is one where I feel like the political ideology and the scholarship collapse. It's very difficult to be part of this conversation unless you align with a particular political identity on the far left. And my question for you is, do you feel like there was some failure to distinguish between bad faith actors who really were trying to weaponize disagreements or online narratives, and good faith actors who simply were expressing a disagreement or a concern about the way things were proceeding?
May I ask?
Yeah, I've got questions.
Yeah.
The first question is, where does the quote come from, and who does the quote come from?
Sure, that's Alicia Garza.
Okay.
Her book.
The second question that I would ask there is about the assumption that you have to align in one way or another. Massification, to the opening comments that I made, are one of the central problems that we have. It is possible to ask critical questions in either space, if we want to talk about it along a binary, and not be painted in a specific way. In fact, this goes back to the claim about the inquiry on grooming gangs, right? If the fear is about being labeled racist, then what's happening there is that someone is making equivocation between being called a name and doing actual harm. So you're not leaving space to talk about what those actual harms are. I see that same sort of problem when we claim that you have to align in a specific way or risk being called a name or being left out of a discussion. What Garza is bringing up in her analysis is that the massification that takes place when you talk about a movement like the Movement for Black Lives is that it's overall violent, and that if you do not agree with what BLM is saying, or you have a point of quibble with the way that they present their arguments, then some, in fact, inside would say that you do not belong with us. That is a minoritized perspective. That is not a perspective of people who are interested in progress and struggle and recognize that there is no perfect way for us to get there. So I do take issue with this idea that you have to be aligned with certain liberal thinkers in order to do this work and do it productively.
And my question would be, I think it would help me understand the answer if you could give an example of what the type of issue.
Testing. Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, for example, I used to teach a course on Islam at the State Department. And I was attacked several times by people on the left who said that it was inappropriate to teach any class on Islam because that would propagate Islamophobia. I was told, for instance, that if we addressed the problem of Salafism or jihadism or talked about the relationship there, that was propagating negative narratives about Islam. And, you know, I can mention here that, of course, we brought in imams who agreed with me, and et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, it's a dangerous space. It's considered to be a dangerous space. And I take issue a little bit with the idea that it doesn't cause any harm to be labeled something. I think that's
That's not what I said.
okay. Well, maybe I misunderstood then. It sounded like you said it was...
No, I said there's making equivocation between actual harm and being labeled. There is, so the
being
critique
labeled
there...
is not actual harm.
I'm not saying that this is, we can understand things to be not zero-sum, correct?
Absolutely.
And the critique there that you're offering is that people came and they had critique of the State Department doing this education. They have plenty of reason to do so. An analysis of the state and how the state has positioned Islam is part of the reason that they would have such an argument. So the issue there, and it is one of taking up criticism and really looking through structurally what it means, where it comes from, where it originates, and engaging in the argument that way, is that if you do not agree with this particular body doing this work, lay out for us why. Sure. Help us to understand why that is, but recognize that we are also part of a tool and an apparatus for doing education, and that's part of our responsibility. Did those complaints, let me ask this, did those complaints stop you from doing this work?
Yes.
Why is that?
I was directed to change my curriculum. I was told the sort of people that I should bring in, should not bring in. I was told we had to, you know, address their concerns, et cetera. So yeah, it was interference in the honest conduct of my work. Now there's gray zones and everything, like you say, right? I acknowledge that. My question was really about whether you think there was a collapse between the recognition of bad faith actors and good faith actors.
So, I'm going to go in a different direction. That I think hopefully it could be helpful to some. Onyx Impact is developing an AI for Black communities. It's called Aisha. It's because AI, and if you get it. Do you get it? Because it's like, it's AI. It's like, you get, and one of the things I know is that when we launch this app, we're going to get attacked, right? And we're going to get attacked, and we know that it's going to make mistakes, right? But because of the harm that AI has done, especially to communities of color, right? There is going to be a reaction that is in many ways justified. And when we make mistakes, guess what? We're not going to get grace. But if we think we're doing good work, right? How do we bring in those folks How do we acknowledge that that is going to happen? Be willing to move forward in that space. And understand that, like, you're not going to be able to do everything correctly. But again, if the work is worth doing, if the work is good, then the work is good.
Mobashra?
Yeah. One of the things usually when I come across academic work on Salafism or jihadism, words that I find a bit loaded, is that they are used in the context to explain political violence by Muslims. And they go to the Quran, which is the holy book for Muslims, as the source of explanation for why Muslims engage in violence, as if Muslims are not political beings, as if there's no social, political, economic, and any sort of other factors that go into play. You would not, or I have not seen any other group be analyzed in this manner. For example, I am not going to go to the Old Testament to explain why Benjamin Netanyahu is carrying out a genocide in Gaza. I'm not going to go to the Bible to explain why Donald Trump is going after minorities and marginalized communities in the US. But we seem to have this double standard in academia where Muslims can only be understood, our actions can only be identified through the lens of religion, and it goes back to looking at the Quran as the root to explain why militants might engage in actions that harm others. We don't really apply this lens of analysis to any other group, and I could understand why people would have issue with that argument and that curriculum, because within academia I have seen this. Not to harp on it, but in one of my undergraduate courses I was very interested in terrorism and insurgency and why groups engage in such horrific acts of violence. When it came to looking at Muslim perpetrators, my professor only focused on religion. When it came to any other group that engaged in suicide bombings or mass political violence, we looked at other factors. And I found this discrepancy very interesting because it flattens Muslims and looks at us through a racialized lens. Because Muslims are perceived as only black or brown, again, there's that racialized narrative of they're inherently a threat. To explain that threat, you look at their religion, which teaches them about jihad, which again is a distorted term. So there's a lot I can talk about within that. In terms of collapsing of good and bad faith actors, I think the conversation always comes down to, when it comes to Islamophobia, I will have a conversation with you if you can accept my humanity. If you dehumanize me, then I don't think a conversation can be had. And I find that a lot of the arguments about, well, there's two sides and so on and so forth, especially in today's context. Yes, there are two sides, but both sides have to acknowledge the other person's humanity. And that is the ground that that's the foundation I begin with.
Girl, you were cooking.
I know that we are over time. If there are other questions, we look forward to speaking with you on the break. Thank you so much for your attention.